Welcome, Rome, Epicureans, Stoics, Skeptics, and we would add Cynics as well. Um, in this video, we will go through this outline like we've done in previous videos. The idea is to kind of get a top layer, big picture view of what's going on in this handout. And so to get started, we have our set of core questions. We have some of the historical backdrop. Then we have these four, what sometimes is referred to as a sort of self help philosophy people. And then in the end, we'll just ask some questions about what these four groups were up to. The first thing is, what is the core questions? Well, it's a it's a useful question. It's interesting to ask it pretty much at any time during any generation or any point in history. Is how is one supposed to be happy or achieve some level of happiness or contentment or tranquility or peace? You could use any of those words. There's a footnote associated with this notion of happiness. How could that be, or how can that be obtained during one's lifetime while they're living in a precarious world or in uncertain times or times that are very stressful? But also, how would this be achieved during the good times? How would you do it during either scenario? During the sort of neutral, where it's not too stressful, it is a little, but not a lot. How would you achieve happiness in a world gone mad, very precarious world? Or how would you achieve it in the golden age or the good times when everything seems to be going well? I mean, how do you achieve this sort of mental state or state of being, however one wants to describe it? Um, so, in order to understand what the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics, and the Skeptics were up to, well, the first thing is that this is the question they're trying to answer. All of their philosophical projects are directed at trying to provide an answer to this kind of question and the various versions of it that are listed here. To understand how they came about, why it was necessary for them to start really paying attention to this question, why to them that doing philosophy at all meant trying to answer a question like this, as well as other things. You could have metaphysical, epistemological concerns like what's the nature of reality, what is knowledge. They cared about those kind of questions too, but the core of their focus was on how to be happy, how to secure happiness. I mean, that seems like something human beings often care a significant about. And so the way this handout works around some core questions is, well, what events caused the psychological, mental, emotional effects or needs that the Epicureans and the Stoics, etc., what they arose to fulfill? So very rarely in history do you see something that's trying to solve a problem without there being a problem that they think they're trying to solve. So when you're asking this kind of question, how to be happy in a precarious world, or how can I secure happiness in the world or the time we're in? Well, that implies that there's some need, that there's a need. People feel this need to kind of start wondering about that. Normally, it implies, well, maybe they're not so happy right now in their current circumstances. Well, that was certainly the case of the events that led up to the occurrence of these philosophers, that there were stresses and strains in their societies. And then these philosophy people rose up and were addressing questions and concerns that people of that era had. And so then the versions of this question, how to be happy in a precarious world, you can state it a lot of different ways. Each question's a little different, but they're all trying to get to that core idea of, like, how does one find happiness in a world gone mad? Or in the Greek, there was this notion of ataraxia. I may, if the pronunciation isn't the way you think it should be, that's fine. There's the word. And it's a Greek notion of being troubled. Like, and so the question would be, how could one be untroubled during troubling times, during uncertain times, during times that cause a bunch of stress or strain. And so, how about one secure happiness, tranquility during uncertain and dangerous or even the good times? So that if you're going to create a theory or a set of arguments about here's what you need to do to mitigate the badness you feel when you're living in bad times, well, if it's a really good theory, then it should also be able to tell that's whatever the suggestions and advice offered should also work for little stresses and strains during the good times. I mean, that should make sense that if you've got a route to be happy in the worst of times, then that route should, in some way, one would think, be able to help one be even more happy in the best of times, perhaps. Something worth thinking about. And then finally, like what we want to know is, well, how did these groups, these four groups of people, Epicureans, Stoics, etc., how did they answer these kind of questions? And each of them answered in a very different way. There are some close similarities between Epicureans and Stoics, but they are distinctively different. And then the skeptics and the cynics are certainly different from the Epicureans and Stoics and from one another. And so, how did they try to answer these questions? Remember, the pattern in philosophy is always the same. Is questions are asked, answers are provided for those questions, and then you have to have reasons for those answers in support of them, your evidence, your data. Why should I believe the answer someone provides? So that's what all of those needed to provide. And then, do some or all of these reasons, are any of them true? Do any of the ideas that these people propose of ways to be happy, do they seem true? Do they seem plausible? Do they seem accurate? Or do they seem to be fundamentally mistaken in certain kinds of ways? Those are questions worth answering. So moving forward, the first thing to notice is this week we're leaping over Aristotle. And we're focusing on what's often the time period or the era of philosophy is referred to as Hellenistic philosophy. Well, first of all, why are we leaping over Aristotle? Because of time. Aristotle is extremely important for the history of philosophy. It's undeniable that he's important. He's just as important as Plato. But Aristotle would take a few weeks to really understand well. And what we're trying to do is skip, like, remember it the first week, I said we skip across the surface of a kind of flat pond rather than go into depth every place that we could. And so with Aristotle, that's a potential multi-week thing that we would have to do. And it's more useful to me in the intro class to get as far out there as we can to try to get to where we are today and what philosophy is up to today and contemporary concerns and stuff than it is to get lodged into Aristotle. I encourage everybody, if you get the opportunity, it's absolutely worth learning about Aristotle. Had a tremendous impact on the sciences. I mean, he's the one that did all the taxonomies and this notion, like you have your biologies and you have your meteorology and you have your psychology. I mean, Aristotle's right there. Aristotle was started with a lot of the logic stuff. He was not the only one, but he's tremendously important as far as the history of philosophy and Western civilization go. Aristotle has had a tremendous impact, and we will encounter some of his ideas percolating through other people later. But for our purposes, we're leaping over him, and we're jumping to Hellenistic philosophy. Well, what is Hellenistic? What does it mean? Well, the Greeks were the Hellenes. It wasn't always called Greeks. So what Hellenistic is Greekish, like Greek-like. There is a lot of influence because a lot of conquests are happening during this era from the Macedonians and the Romans, as we'll see going into this. But it was not pure Greek anymore. It wasn't like just completely Greek. It's like as empires start to form, you get what's called a more cosmopolitan societies, where there's people from many different places, even more so than there was before. I mean, it's not like the Greeks did not have people from many different cultures and places. Pretty much everybody around the Mediterranean Sea was going in and out of Greek. Is a gigantic sea trade place, like Athens and these various places, Corinth and all that. But they had not. it wasn't a situation where we're all part of the same culture. Whereas that stuff starts happening when we get conquest. And so either way, it's Greekish. It's not just as like just Greek ideas and only Greek ideas. No, these people and some of the Stoics and Epicureans and skeptics, they were from different places around the Mediterranean Sea. And and there's various ideas intermingling. So the ideas of so we're focusing on Hellenistic philosophy, and these people appeared when? Well, after the death of Aristotle and his pupil. Aristotle was a mentor in terms of a teacher to Alexander the Great. And so we go from the death of Aristotle and Alexander the Great, these years, up to the death of, say, Epictetus, which was a Stoic. We'll see a lot from Epictetus in this handout, up to this, which is 135 AD. Next week, we will be running backwards a little bit, back to the beginning of, say, Christianity. Well, this is 135 years after the beginning of Christianity, so we're taking in a wide swath, and then next week we have to go back a little, but but this is just the way it's normally presented, is a sort of standard way, is you just cover all the Hellenistic philosophy people all at one time, or in terms of you group them all together, because the original ideas for Epicureanism, Stoicism, things like that, they all started in this time frame, and then they just went forward. And Stoicism and stuff is still perfectly alive and well today. So, but the span is approximately 400 years. So clearly the detail, we're going to miss some detail. It's just, the nature of covering that many years in a single swoop. But Hellenistic philosophy is sometimes called self-help or therapeutic philosophy. And it's a type of philosophy, it's crafted, it's purpose-built, its core purpose is to help people understand reality, how their minds and their motivations work, so that they can secure more happiness, inner peace, contentment, etc. in their personal lives. So it's like, if you understand the way reality works, the world in which we live and the processes, regularities, things like that, and you understand how your own mind works, well, then the hope is that if we get clear about those things, then we're better able to secure things like happiness for ourselves. And each group tries to offer different ideas and practices to achieve happiness. But in order to understand, why did these people arise? What was the need that kicked off, that was fulfilled, or at least an attempt to fulfill by the Hellenistic philosophy people? Well, it all goes to these Macedonian and Roman conquests and the psychological, emotional, mental effects of such things. And I do it this way, where it's simply stated that conquering people, say you're the conqueror, you want to build an empire, that is very hard. Psychologically, emotionally, there's many ways in which it's hard. I mean, it is scary anybody that's been in the military will know that a person can be brave, but that doesn't mean they're not scared. To run out there and potentially get hurt, get maimed, or to hurt others. Those sorts of things are very taxing on the human psyche and in our minds. And no matter how it is you go into such things, you'll never come back out mentally quite the same. Doesn't mean you'll be a bad person or anything like that. It just means that these are big traumatic events. It's traumatic to be a conqueror, as well as it is traumatic to be conquered, to be the loser of the battles. So the winners take a hit psychologically, the losers do too. And in winners and losers, that's a kind of rough way to put it, but it is. It's the people that do the conquering and the people that get conquered. Both of them don't walk away unchanged. It puts tons of stress, tons of anxiety. Imagine that if you're the recipient of being conquered, well, then the conquerors normally are going to have a different culture, a different way of doing things. Well, in the case of the Macedonians coming in and conquering what Sparta had taken over from Athens, they were Greek. It's Greeks conquering Greeks. But the Macedonians are doing more than they don't just stop with the Greeks. They start conquering well around the Mediterranean Sea. Alexander the Great was building an empire. And so I'd encourage people to look at maps. Just look up Alexander the Great's empire map. And you'll be able to see the span of what he was doing. And so the key to it all is there's a lot of disorientation. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of what they call soul searching. There's a lot of distress that occurs not only with the people being conquered, but those doing the conquering. And so there's a need immediately of, well, how can I get the stress to go away? How can I mentally reset? That's questions that people start to wonder about and they care about a lot. So the thing to do though is, well, okay, what started all this? Well, you had that Second Peloponnesian War. As I mentioned, that's when the Athenians and the Spartans, they were both superpowers. They battle it out. Sparta comes out on top. But was that such a good thing? Well, one of the most significant outcomes of the war is that nearly all the Greek communities associated with Athens and Sparta are tremendously militarily, economically, resource, every kind of way weaker. When you take two superpowers that are basically evenly matched and they battle each other, it doesn't matter if it's 2,500 years ago like this or if it's today. If you have a clash between two superpowers, and this has happened many times throughout human history, that everybody comes out weaker. The one that wins will be the stronger for a while, but they will not be as strong maybe as they were when it started. They may be. They may do a lot of military buildup. It may have an economic boom, things like that after it. That's what kind of happened after World War II with the United States. Is it was this big industrial base, and there's a lot of prosperous times that come after it, but then that stuff catches up eventually too. And so, but in this case, the Spartans were weakened tremendously. They've defeated the Athenians, sort of. And they're sort of controlling the Greek territories of the Athenians and what they already did, but they're weaker. And so, well, when you're weak, well, then that makes the people that were not as strong as you before, you may fall below the level of them. So what you were once a superpower, now someone that was not your equal in terms of power and affluence before, now they're more powerful than you. And that's essentially what it seems like happened is the Spartans won, but in their winning, they weakened themselves so much that then another group of Greeks, the Macedonians, under Philip II, king of Macedonia, and his son, Alexander the Great, that they just conquered them all. I mean, the Spartans could not hold them back. And so it's kind of like they opened themselves up to be attacked by their very next door neighbors. They've been fighting a neighbor, Athens and Sparta neighbors fighting. Well, one neighbor overcomes the other, but then there's another third neighbor out there called Macedonia that comes in, and it takes time. It takes a lot of years. It didn't immediately happen. I mean, you can look at the dates. That's where dates are helpful, is you have 404 BC is Sparta's defeats the Athenians. Well, then 339, and these years are counting down to zero. So you've got what, 44 years? Yeah. So, I mean, that's not a whole lifetime of people. In principle, the people that were young at this time, which some of the philosophy people were, I mean, Plato's born right after this. Well, by this time, you're right there in the middle that you've overcome this war, but then all of a sudden, here's another one coming with your neighbors. And so then they come in. Well, the Macedonians defeat the Spartans and most of the Greek places. But the Macedonians were Greek too. And one of the biggest changes, like you want to talk about a psychological change, a consequence of conquest, is that before Alexander the Great comes in and makes this big empire, is that you would have had people that would have been proud to say, I'm an Athenian, I'm a Spartan, I'm a Corinthian. These city-states were, even though Athens and Sparta were the superpowers, you still had room for, say, Corinth and stuff to be a powerful city-state into its own as well. But it just aligns with us, or Athenian or Spartan. That's what these other major city-states did during the Peloponnesian Wars. They would, they become allies of the superpowers, it's like today. And what it amounts to, though, is that you have this kind of significant cultural identity that's based around your city-state, and there was 1,000+ of these things. Well, once you become a person in an empire, though, your city, Corinth, is just, it's Alexander's empire. Sparta, that's Alexander's empire. You're no longer a sort of semi-autonomous entity yourself that the citizens are building their identities around, which the Greeks did at that time, of who they are, what their goals are. Each city-state could have a little bit different way of thinking what good citizenship was. Well, all of a sudden, you have to worry about being a good citizen in Alexander's empire. You're no longer nearly the autonomous. It's the same thing as if you have, imagine if the United States was like you have 50 states, but imagine if they were all independent countries. And then all of a sudden, you unite them. And so that's kind of the way it was at times with the colony times here. In the U.S., there was quite a bit more autonomy than when you unite. You lose that hardcore autonomy and independence. You give up some independence and freedoms in order to be a part of this bigger group. But in this case, when you're under conquest, you don't get a choice. It's like it's not like you all agreed to be a larger one. No, you become a part of a larger one, whether you want to be or not, and that's psychologically taxing. It's taxing just to unify too. But following Alexander's death, his main generals divided up the empire. So he had a big empire under Alexander, and then when he dies, there's no clear line of succession. There's not a mechanism to put the next emperor. So the generals just divided up, say, hey, okay, you take this part, I'll take this part, we'll take this part. It's kind of like when someone dies today and their land's divided amongst their children. That's kind of what you saw at this time. Well, so the first prize of the Spartans defeating the Athenians is they get conquered by the Macedonians. The second thing, though, is the Macedonians end up in a war with Rome, the Roman Republic. As Rome was a republic, then it became an empire. Well, the idea is that the Macedonians, they did not win against the Romans. They didn't win. And Greeks never were in control until way later, even in like 1829. You can look at this footnote, that it's kind of like there was, say, two prizes to the winners of the battle between the Spartans and Athenians, the Spartans and then all the Greeks, that are under Spartan control. Well, what is one consequence of the Peloponnesian War is the Spartans and all the Greeks weaken themselves. Then that next group of Greeks, the Macedonians, come in and conquest on top of you, and you become a part of the Macedonian Empire, Alexander's empire. Well, then that empire gets conquered by the Romans. So this is twice conquered peoples. So if it's stressful to be conquered once, it's stressful to even more so to be conquered twice. And the Roman Empire now, that's different. That's not Greeks conquering Greeks. That is a different group of people. Romans, that they knew the Greeks. I mean, they traded, communicated. But the Roman Republic, which eventually became an empire, the Roman Republic, they were not the same. They had their own language, from Etruscan to Latin to the various ways that morphed. And so this is not Greek-speaking people conquering Greek-speaking people at the time of the Romans. This is Latin-speaking people conquering Greek-speaking people. Now, there were benefits, though. Anytime there's a new, one is conquered, there typically are benefits. That each culture or each group or each empire brings about certain benefits. They have different ways of doing things. Sometimes those ways may be a little bit better in political, legal, it could be moral terms. It just depends. Well, some of the benefits of being a member of the Roman Republic, being a citizen, is, well, first of all, being a citizen, citizenship was offered to these conquered peoples. Like Rome didn't just come in and just take over and say, okay, now everybody's enslaved to us. That's not the way they did things. What they did is they say, well, it's kind of like a sort of you can think of the Godfather movie. We'll make you an offer you can't refuse, and if you do refuse, well, we'll fight you and win, and then you're going to do what we wanted anyway. I mean, that's just the Romans. They're a superpower, and so what happens is that they would offer you citizenship, they would offer you a certain amount of religious tolerance and freedom. That was the two big things they would try to sell the people on, so that, I mean, the Romans would rather not fight and people just agree to be a part of the republic or the empire than they had to fight. It's a lot easier. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot less costly in lives and trauma and various things to just let people become your vassals, essentially, than it is to have to do military conquest. I mean, the Romans had plenty of intelligence. They were not foolish about these things. But the key to it is if you would accept their offer, become a Roman citizen, and they offered it, and many accepted it because it gave you a right to vote of a sort. Not necessarily a democracy style setup, but still, there's a voting mechanism. And that was mainly for those who lived close to Rome or the hub, wherever Rome was putting its power centers at the time. And then you could hold public office, you could marry other free people, you could engage in trade and commerce within the empire, essentially be able to have a business license if you're a citizen, and you had the right to own and inherit property. But one of the most important things that we still operate under a lot of this today is that one of the biggest things the Roman Republic and Empire created is a legal system. A system to deal with disagreements between people, but also to manage things that would be considered crimes inside the Republic or the Empire. And so a lot of things one would be familiar with today. Like you have this this is where your notion of innocent till proven guilty kind of comes from, is from Rome, the Republic, the empires, or the empire. And so the idea would be, it's not quite like innocent till proven guilty. It's more like you don't get extremely tortured and punished terribly until you've at least been adjudicated guilty by a Roman official. Now that, of course, could be corrupted. It could be bought off, all that normal stuff. I mean, it's terrible to say that's normal, but it is. And it doesn't mean it's right or good. It just means that this kind of stuff happens in these big bureaucratic systems. And that's what the Roman Republic and Empire were, is it's the epitome of what you call bureaucracy, a ton of administrators, middle managers, the governors that go over. And once Rome conquests a group or they agree to become a part of the Republic or the Empire, well, then Rome's going to send in its own people to manage things or to oversee other people managing it. So maybe they'll let you keep your mayor, but you've got somebody in the office of the mayor. The mayor's office has to run all their ideas through the Roman offices before it gets approval. Things like that. And but you also had a right to a trial, right to appeal. You had this right to free movement through the empire using those Roman roads. The Romans built a lot of things. They built irrigation systems. They built aquifers. They built that's just a water transport system. They built which is important. I mean, that's like standard water moving it around. People need water for their animals, for themselves. And any system that makes that more efficient, that's a contribution. And then that also, your citizenship had elevated your social status. It enabled you to rub shoulders with more elite Roman groups, all things that are appealing to some. And so it also meant that you didn't have to, like Rome takes over your protection, that instead of having to worry about pirates and raiders, things that the Greek groups, 1,000 separate little city-states and communities had to worry about. Well, that and each of them has to have their own militia-style military to defend their interest. Well, when you're a part of the empire, then that becomes Rome's job. And Rome will manage your people, train your people, so there's more efficiency there. and they were good militarily. The Romans were decent soldiers in terms of their ability to do military things. And so also, so that takes some stress away. You have this bigger, larger, more powerful military that will defend your interest. And if you didn't live on a border of the republic or the empire, you weren't going to have to experience constant clashes and stuff. But then also they had all these skilled labor with this engineering projects, and a person could have opportunities to learn these building techniques, these construction techniques, which the Greeks knew how to build buildings. But the Romans just were able to do these things on mass scale. And you can get a sense of how Rome's legal system and how free travel worked. A person can read something like in the Christian Bible, you can see Acts of the Apostles and see Paul and the others traveling around in Rome, and you also see how the legal system of Paul worked. You get a glimpse of it. You read a lot of other history books that have this described too, but if you just want to see it from like the point of view of the people using the roads and experiencing the legal system as a defendant in it, then Acts is not a bad place to look. So there were perks, there were advantages, there were benefits to being a part of the Roman Republic and later the Empire. There are also some significant cons, and this is where the psychological stresses and strains come about. Is that you're necessarily having to assimilate to a Roman way of doing things, which can be different. And anybody that's an immigrant or come from an immigrant family would know that it's not easy to go into and fit in and figure out what to do in a culture that does things differently than the culture you came out from. Even the subtle differences are stressful. And so all the people had to deal with that. And it definitely, with the social tiers that in Rome, it was also stressed that if you could sell yourself into slavery if you couldn't pay your debts, or you could just be a slave like the Romans did, like the Greeks and all the rest. Various conquered peoples sometimes get sold into slavery, and then that's used in the labor force. Somebody's building those roads after all. And not saying that's nice. I'm just saying that's the way this stuff kind of played out. And then it's also, though, you had it as a slave in Rome, you make the wrong person mad. And it's not like they beat you, they torture you. Yeah, they do that. But a slave had rights, certain amount in Rome, more so than they maybe would have had in even some of the Greek communities. But you also had these punishments that were very significant too. Or just you could be sold for the entertainment to be tossed into the Colosseums or whatever entertainment and fight. People are familiar with the notion of gladiators. And if you're not, you can just look up Roman gladiators and see how it worked. But there's also like they enjoyed having wild animals attack people. I mean, this was some of their entertainment, like think of like we have like boxing and football and ultimate fighting and various sports. The Greeks had sports, wrestling and running and all these things. Well, the Romans, one of their pastimes, at least in the Colosseums areas, they watch people fight people to the death, and animals and people against animals and all kinds of stuff. So it's worth looking that up, and you'd see there's something going on there, with the mentality that is different than the Greeks and these people that are being conquered. And so any of that difference adds up. Change causes stress. And there was a significant change of being a part of the Greeks under the Macedonians or the Spartans or Athenians versus being Greeks under the Romans. And it's not just Greeks, it's all these other people as well. And so there's a social hierarchy in Rome that could be very dangerous. Some of the crimes, they had everything from they can sanction you, fine you, destroy your business, your livelihood, whip you. You could lose your citizenship, which was a really bad thing. If you had it, then you lost it. They can banish you, exile you, forced labor. You could be pushed into slavery. They could throw from a cliff, drowned in the rivers, buried alive, death by the beast in that Colosseum. You could also be crucified, which was considered to be one of their worst punishments. And so it's a pretty woe be to anyone who steps afoul of those Roman laws, which people would not have necessarily been totally familiar with when they're first assimilated, or they're in the process of it. But they had opportunities, but the cost of failing could be devastating in Rome. And so the one thing about Rome, though, is they required obedience. That's a hallmark of their style of Republican empire, is that everybody has to answer to somebody. And nobody really gets to buck the chain of command. You know, that there are social betters, social inferiors, and you don't fall afoul of these things, like a caste system almost. Not quite the same as some caste systems, but it's got similarities. And even if you accidentally fall afoul of these things, you can have very serious problems. You lose everything, your family too. But that puts people in a stressful situation. And when people get in a stressful situation, they often turn to their spirituality, their religious stuff. And in Rome, there was tolerance for that. You could do that. But the Romans had their own religion. But it's interesting that Rome conquers Greece, yes, but it's almost like the Greek pantheon conquered Rome back, because most of the Roman gods and goddesses and forces they may have different names, they may change some characteristics, but a lot of it was very similar. Like things like Zeus becomes Jupiter, Venus, the planet is Aphrodite. We'll be familiar with these. These are our planet names to this day. So there's no doubt, that the influence of the Roman Republic and Empire still remains today. I mean, we see various, the names of our very planets still reflect this. But they also had, these goddess of hope and victory, truth, which the Greeks had things like that too. Then they have Fortuna, which is a big one that becomes very big by the time of the Renaissance, is this goddess of luck and chance and fortune. That it's the uncertainties, like you can be riding high, doing well, and then you can be dropped back to the low. It's like the idea of the wheel of fortune comes from this goddess Fortuna, of spin the wheel, see how it turns out. And the idea is you conceptualize that's what life is like. You spin the wheel, and then it's luck where you land. And that became a very significant thought process with people that are already stressed out. And it seems that way in this situation with the Roman Republic and the Empire, that you can be going so well, and then all of a sudden you lose it all. It's like there's like a gamble to existence at this time. But then, in terms of the Roman spiritual sort of worldview, the Roman religion, it conceptualized the relationship between humans and the gods differently than the Greeks. That with the Greeks, you're at the mercy of your gods and goddesses. Humans are the lowest on the power or pecking order and reality scale, and every other spiritual entity is above you. And we exist in the spiritual domain rather than the spiritual domain existing in us. Like it's not something. We are embodied in the spiritual realm in the Greeks. And the Romans had something like that too, but theirs was more like, instead of being at the capricious, fickle whims of gods and goddesses that could like you one day, but then have different interests and take away from you the next, and you're at the complete mercy of this stuff. But the Greeks, they like I said previously, they were happy people. I mean, this was not, some bad thing for them to be totally at the mercy. But the Romans, their mentality is different. Theirs was the gods and the goddesses are helpers. That they're on the side of the Romans. The gods are on our side. That's more Roman mentality. That if you do the rituals right, and you live up to various religious ideals or spiritual ideals with the Roman religion, then the gods and goddesses are there to help you. They're an assistant. They will lend assistance to you. It's not a matter of you're at their mercy. No, they want to help you. That's a different way of thinking about things. That's how the Romans thought about things. Some of them, at least some significant portion. But then one of the main differences is that one is that they conceptualize people, not the Romans did, not necessarily at the mercy of the gods and goddesses, but the gods and goddesses are helpers. They're not hindrances to your goals. But the also thing is that the Romans did something. And I'm sure that some of this happened with the Greeks too, but they commercialized worship. That everybody they conquered had to participate in certain Roman religious festivals, regardless of what you believe. Well, first of all, and everybody has to defer to the councils, the Senate, the emperors, whether it's republic or empire. That you have to ultimately confer your religious beliefs. If they conflict with what the emperor wants, then you still have to give the emperor what the emperor wants. You don't get to like if your religious belief, or your spirituality says you don't pay taxes to other humans, well, that's not going to work in the Roman Empire. Then you can see that, say, in Christianity, where you get the line of Jesus, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. You didn't have any choice. I mean, you were not going to say, oh, well, I'm not going to pay taxes. That's not going to happen in the republic or the empire, regardless of your religious beliefs or spirituality. And so right then that puts religion in a different position than spirituality. The worldview's different there, where previously you do what is necessary by the gods and goddesses, like direct commands down to you. Even the Athenian leaders of these, or the city state, the Greek city states, they had to go along and do to get along with the gods and goddesses. They didn't always do it, but that's the way you think of things. They answer to the gods and goddesses. Whereas in Rome, you answer to the Senate and the emperor, then you go and do your spirituality. So the spirituality and the religious beliefs are not telling the government what to do. No, the government is working in concert supposedly with the spirituality. But if it comes down to this is necessary to expand the empire, then, well, you got to put that religion and spirituality on hold while we expand the empire. So you see, there's a different relationship and pecking order there. And so that changes things. That changes the way one would think about spirituality and religion. And that's different. And difference and stuff like that and change creates stress. And then also they commercialized it. It's like the Romans used their temples. They'd build temples and say, everybody that we conquer, put your idols, your icons, put that in our temple. And then that's kind of, see, our religious tolerance. We have diversity, inclusivity. We have these things. This is the way the Romans would try to sell their stuff to that we take in and don't and we minimally interfere, but not nearly to the degree. We're not going to say that everybody has to be a devout Roman religion adherent. No, you can keep whatever you had, but you still have to participate in some of the activities of the Roman religion at certain times on certain holidays, regardless of what your belief system is. So there's a difference there. That you put your stuff on hold and you can't have a religious stuff that is going to be anti-empire, anti-Roman Republic. You don't get to have one of those. But anything else that'll just kind of get along and keep on going with us, that you can have that. But then also they build these temples and then they commercialize it where you have all these vendors where you can walk up and say, oh, you need to do your sacrifices in the temple. Well, here, we sell all the things you need here. And then when you're coming out, oh, do you want a little idol here to, of your god or goddesses, for a small fee, or a fee, you can have this. Here's your ambulance, all the stuff. And so this was it was a part of Roman economy to sell things around these temples. And this stuff becomes important when you think about Christianity and what it was actually doing and why there was persecutions, is that a huge part of the Roman economy was tied up with those temples and commercialized religion. But all that aside, your tradition could not be against the empire, destabilizing it. And so, in the end, these things are stressful and straining to people, and it starts getting people, kind of puts a bad taste in their mouth. Once the government is involved in your religious and spirituality stuff, you have to defer to them. Yeah, I'm free to practice, but yet I got to practice the stuff that the government says. It puts a bad taste in some people's mouth about It makes spirituality and stuff like a tool being used by the government rather than something that individual groups and traditions and individual people decide for themselves. And now it's a way to make money. It's like it starts to cheapen it in some ways. And then in the higher tiers of Roman society, you get a lot of people that just start doubting any of this, that they see it as a con job. And so you're starting to get some sort of atheistic stuff percolating in the empire. And so that adds even more stress. And so then, well, how do we resolve this? How can we gain happiness in a world like this, like the empire, or even under the Macedonians? So that's where your Hellenistic philosophy people come in, or your self-help. People have a need. They're under the stressful conditions. It's not all bad. It's not all good, but there are some significant psychological stressors. So how can we figure this out? Well, the first that roll in are the Epicureans. One of the easiest ways to think about the Epicureans is you can just think in terms of happiness is getting what you want. So, this is just the way they would think about it. Happiness is getting what you want. Okay? Well, then in order to be happy, you need to get what you want. But you can't always get what you may want. It's not realistic. So you need to have realistic wants. You need to want what you're able to get. So if you only want what you're able to get, then there's a good chance you'll frequently get what you want and you'll be happy. So just think about that again. That's the key to understand the Epicureans, is that if getting what you want is what it takes to be happy, and you could not get everything you could imaginatively want, then what you should do is rein in your wants to more closely align with what you're able to do. And then you'll get more of what you want and you'll be more happy. That's just a big picture of Epicureans. But one could say that, is happiness really about getting what you want? That's a good question. It's worth thinking about. The Epicureans assume that's what it is. And that getting what you want will make you happy. As long as what you want is within your abilities to do. And it's realistic. But all that aside, to move forward with this, Epicurus, here's his dates. He would say that if you're doing philosophy and it's not helping people alleviate some of this suffering of the soul, just think, psychological distress, like soul is kind of psyche. That's one of the ways that a lot of the early Greeks were thinking about it, and the Hellenistic Greeks. So mind and soul, it's not so easy to pull those two apart. One can look at Aristotle and see where he talks about psyche. The soul and psyche, they're not quite the same thing, but they're so tightly tied together that when they talk about suffering of the soul, a lot of times it will be in terms of mental distress, emotional distress. So the idea is, Epicurus essentially says, if you're doing philosophy and you're not trying to alleviate some of these stresses and strains on people's minds and their souls, then what are you doing? It's a waste of time. That's kind of what this quote's saying. And that the Epicureans thought they were following Socrates, where Socrates claimed that he's constantly encouraging the Athenians to care more about the condition, the health of their soul, rather than gaining more wealth, getting caught up in who's the horse race winner of the week, things like that. And Socrates does say that in the Apology, as we've seen, but he says it in many other works that Plato wrote, the early works. Now, Socrates did consistently encourage Athenians to think more about, is this a virtuous thing, or is this maybe a vice-like thing? Is this something that's going to make us better as Athens, or is this something maybe that's deteriorating our values, our ideals, that everybody trying to get more money or more prosperity or more fame, more power? Is that good for Athens? Good for the individual soul? Good for the soul of Athens? And so Socrates cared about that. The Epicureans thought, well, that's exactly what we care about too. And so philosophy should do that. And then, so what are some of the details? How do you secure happiness for the Epicureans? Well, I've already said it, that you rein in your wants and desires to more closely match what you're able to do with resources. And then if you go for wants and desires that are constrained in that way, you stand a better chance of obtaining them. And so you stand a better chance of being happy more often if fulfilling your wants is indeed what it takes to be happy. But there's more detail to this. There's a more detailed way that they describe this. They claim Epicurus, at least. There's other Epicureans besides Epicurus, but we just focused on him because we have that letter that he wrote to a friend, and in it he talks about that happiness has these various parts, these things you need to do, and you can be happy. The first is that you want to recognize or accept or come to believe that the gods and the goddesses are so different from human beings that they're not really micromanaging us. That's one reliever of a stress. Instead of being worried about, are the gods watching me? Am I doing something wrong all the time? Or am I doing something right? Am I living up to their expectations? The Epicureans would say you don't have to worry about any of that. That the gods and the goddesses, yes, they're there, they exist, but they're so very different from us. They're not wearing clothes and shoes and eating and all this stuff. Well, that's like Xenophanes that we saw in the pre-Socratic suite. That's a very significant breakaway from the standard Greek or the early Greek spiritual worldview. First of all, it's that. It's a move the pre-Socratics made, like Xenophanes. And so Epicureans are going back to that idea. It had never gone anywhere. It was still in the Greek society. And so you think of the gods and goddesses, that's one belief you'd have, is they're so far different from us that you don't have to worry about them, intruding or interfering or caring anything about what we do. We're kind of on our own. So that's supposed to bring some solace. And then the next thing is you don't have to worry about death. This is one of the unique, famous or infamous, whichever way a person wants to think about it, with Epicurus's argument against death being something to fear. And the simple way to think about it is that he argues, and I summarize his argumentation here, but the sort of short summary of it would be that if living is experiencing and sensing things with our five senses, and death is the cessation of all those things. There is no sensing, no experiencing in death. That's an assumption, but that's one he makes. And so if living includes experiencing and sensing, and that's the stuff that could hurt us or be painful to us or be good for us, that if we can feel it, it could be a hurtful feeling or a good feeling. Well, we are afraid a lot of times of things that we think will hurt us. Well, so life involves experiencing and potentially experiencing things that'll hurt us. Well, death involves no experiencing. So Epicurus would say that death can never hurt you because it can never be painful. You experience nothing during death. So death's nothing to fear. That wherever you are as a live person, death is not. And wherever death is, you as a live person are not. So your two paths in existence never cross. A live person never actually meets up with death. That the two things are running on two totally separate tracks. Like think of two parallel lines. There's death over there. There's life. There's death on one side. There's life on the other side, and those two lines never cross paths. They're two perfectly parallel tracks. You just hop from one to the other. And so wherever you are, death never is, and wherever death is, you never are. So you don't have to be afraid of it. And so that would take away the fear of death. So you take away these two big fear factors where and in these conquered societies, you'd be worried about dying and worried about, all those things. But Epicurus would say you don't have to worry about those things. You don't have to worry about the gods and goddesses jumping in and going to punish you for bad things, nor do you have to worry about dying. Plausible? I leave that for everyone else to think about. And then the final part of it is this notion that so you can take those two stressors away, Epicureanism normally does. Then the next thing is to rein in those wants and desires to more better align with what your abilities and resources is. And one way to think about that is that you live prudently. But let's think about, first of all, reining in your wants and desires to match your resources. What is that? Well, say that you have a certain amount of money. I use an example here. Say you have $20,000 is how much money you have to spend. You have no way to get any more at this moment in time. Well, if you want a car that costs $1 million, you have no way to put anything on credit. You got $20,000 to work with. Well, your want is going to be constantly thwarted because you have no way of obtaining that $1 million dream car. You only have $20,000, and $20,000 is a long way from $1 million. And so you're like, well, do I just suffer forever wanting something I cannot ever get? Or do I rein my wants in and look for maybe a used car or maybe a new one that costs $20,000, and then I can get that, and I have a new car, I can enjoy the car. And Epicureans would say, yeah, and that's what you should do. If you really need a car, you want the car, you're able to afford the car, it's not going to detract terribly to spend the money on the car, all those qualifications. But say that, yes, indeed, you've got $20,000 you could spend on a car, and it's not going to hurt you in any other way in life. It will just enhance your mobility, your ability to get around. Well, then you should want the car that you can afford, rather than the car you have no way of affording at that moment in time. So remember, if happiness is getting what you want, you should want what you can actually get. Rein in your wants. And then it goes forward. Well, how does prudence fit in? What is prudence? Well, I'm not going to read through all these characteristics of prudence, but there's the features of it here. And what it amounts to is they would say that you end up with a moderation of your wants, where before you form a want, what their technique is, their advice of how to secure happiness is you should always want what you can actually get. Well, how do I determine what I can actually get? You run through these A through E here. It's like you before you really want something, you should think about, understand and think about what it is you would be choosing. Like, okay, let me really think about this car, even if I can afford it. Well, first of all, can I afford it? But second of all, will it meet the needs that I have, my base needs? Like, is it reliable, or is it going to be broken all the time? Things like that. And then think about your actual reasons and motives for wanting something. Do I really need the car? Or do I just want it as a status symbol? Or do I want it because I need it? Or do I want the particular car that I'm picking for stupid reasons? Like, well, or less than the best you could use. Instead of using the notion of stupidity, let's use just for reasons that I want the car because I saw my friends are driving a car like it. I don't know if it's any good, but I like the way it looks. Is that the best motive or reason to be getting the car you're getting? Or maybe your needs are, it's got to take me back and forth 50 miles each direction, so 100 miles a day to go to work. Maybe I need a car that's more reliable rather than the one that I just want because all my friends have one like it. So you need to think about your motives and reasoning for what you think a car, and you do this before you settle on which car you would actually think you want and that you can afford. Are the reasons selfish? Are they whatever? Then you be cautious and avoid taking unnecessary risk. Like that would be, is this car reliable? Or that's also thinking about, okay, if I spend this $20,000 on the car, can I really afford to spend the whole $20,000, or would I be safer if I spent $10,000 and kept the other $10,000 for a rainy day? Now it's like mitigating your risk. Then there's also trying to predict and carefully consider these immediate and future consequences of the choices and the actions. Like, how long is this car going to last? What's going to happen if I get this car? Does it take a lot of gas to drive it back and forth? So even if it's an affordable machine, it's a machine that I like for decent reasons. It'll do what I need it to do. But how's it going to play out in the long run? I mean, is it going to cost so much in gas that I can't afford to drive it? That's like future consequence, or is this something maybe my children can inherit, or is this something the children are never going to want to drive? So if I need another car later, is this something that I'm just going to have to try to sell, or is this something maybe I could hand down? That's short and long range consequences. Also, you need to be very skilled at accurately identifying what your abilities and your resources actually are. And I use another example here about, say that you have a situation with Sally and Bob, where Sally thinks she may want to date Bob, but the idea is, does Sally have the ability to actually capture Bob's attention? He hadn't noticed her yet. If she thinks she does, if she thinks that she does have that ability, and then the Epicureans are going to say, fine, you could go for it as long as it meets those other, these A through E up here. She'd have to go through all these things. And remember, this is what happens before we commit to wanting something. And so it puts a detached, an analytical perspective between a person thinking, maybe I want that. Then you do this analysis, all of these things. Then you settle on the want. And the idea is, if you do this analysis before you firmly fixate and set it as a life goal or a short-term goal, dating a person, buying a particular car, or wanting a particular, to date a particular person, wanting to buy a particular car, wanting a particular house, all these things, wanting a particular job, whatever you could want or desire, that you do this before you settle on exactly what that house is, or exactly that car, exactly the person. That Epicureans say, if you go through this kind of analysis first, your wants will more closely match what you're actually able to get in reality, and then you're able to get it, and that'll make you happy. So there's not all this frustration of wanting what you can't have. And so the idea is, if you know what you're able to do, you only want what you're able to do, and only do what you're able to do, then you stand the most realistic chance of being happy. And so think about what the Epicureans have done there with this, and this is the key to it all, is this A through E right here, is that this is they're helping people realize that you don't always have to go for the first thing that comes to your mind when you want. Maybe that would be a bad idea to do. Instead, if you want to be happy, maybe you need to do this sort of analysis of things before you fully commit to what you want. And that's trying to teach people how to analyze and think and use their minds to mitigate the losses or the distresses of not getting what they want. So it's a technique. It's interesting. Plausible? I leave that for everyone in the class to decide. But I also noticed the Epicureans were moderate. They were not saying that just because, say that one was able to go to all these drinking parties and all kinds of stuff all the time. Say that they could do those things, they had the resources to do them, they're able to do them, but realize they have to go through that A through E before determining, is this what I really want to spend my time doing every day? And what that's going to mean is you're likely not to be continuously drinking and reveling big parties and satisfying every lust that you could have. That they would say, no, that you're setting yourself up to be disappointed if you do these things, or because there can be long range consequences for behaviors like this. Like you can get addicted, or you could get a disease, or all these things that could happen, that if you engage in indulging every lust and every, substance, everything that you could want to do, and you may have the money, you may have the time, you may have the ability to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you should want. And you run it through that process of analysis, that A through E, that prudence analysis, before you decide, yeah, this is what I'll do. And Epicureans would say, if you run it through that sort of analysis, you would see that this kind of behavior is likely not what you should be wanting if you want to be happy. And remember, it's all about being happy. They're not saying you can't do those things. They're just saying, if you do these sort of wild desires, fulfilling them, then the odds are it's not going to create happiness in the long run. Interesting. And so you can make some observations about them. that Epicureanism, to get to happiness, you have a kind of two-part move. You first get these anti-fear beliefs. Now, the gods aren't micromanaging, caring what we do. You're not afraid of death. Then you go through that method of analyzing your wants before you settle on them in a prudential manner so that you're more able to get what you want because you've reined in your wants to realistic abilities to get. And then they also assume that, like I said, that this is a big assumption that being happy involves being able to consistently get what you want. Is that true? Some would say no. There are groups, a lot of religious spiritual groups would say no. I mean, a lot of those are based on this notion of denying yourself various things because that's what the divine expects you to do. It's not about getting what you want, it's about living in accordance with the will of the divine. So the Epicureans are not consistent with certain spiritualities and religious perspectives. So they assume that getting what you want, that you can get, that you're able to get what you want, and then you get it. That should make you happy. Some would say that no, I mean, that it's not about what humans want, it's about what the divine wants. And so doing what the divine wants people to do, it'll make them truly happy. Whereas just indulging in whatever humans want is never going to make you truly happy. We'll see some of that with St. Augustine. The next thing is that Epicureans, they often they connect your happiness. Being able to secure happiness is connected very tightly to being able to get a lot of real world stuff that exists outside your body. Like if you want that car, well, that's not in your body. That's outside your body. That's in the world. You want a particular person. You want to date them. Well, that's an entirely different human being. That's outside your body. That's external to you. You want a house. You want a college degree. These are things that are out in the external world, and Epicureanism assumes that some of that stuff's going to play along with you. A lot of it is, and they may be right about that. That may be a kind of obvious thing to assume, like, yeah, I can get cars. They're out there. I can buy them, But the thing is what if there were no cars? I mean, sure, you can do your prudence analysis and you can be like, well, okay, that I should only want what I can get. Well, if there are no cars, I shouldn't want cars. So they have a way to kind of push back on this. But there's still this dependency is that if you were in a world where you could never satisfy any pleasures, even little ones, the Epicureans they may have no help for you at all. That if you're in a situation, imagine if you were, say, a Roman or a Greek slave, that you have no ability to push back and you get a really bad person that's in charge of you and they torture you every day because they're sadistic or mean. Well, the Epicureans, is it possible for them to help that person attain some level of happiness? If the idea is to get what you want, what is we normally going to want? We're normally going to want the things that make us feel good, that are pleasant. A new car's nice, smells good. Oh, this is cool. Drives so much better than my old car. Pleasurable experiences. But also this idea of we want to avoid painful experiences. Like we don't want to be hurt. We don't want to suffer. I mean, that would be the opposite of happiness. So it's kind of getting your wants to be pleasurable, but you also want to avoid painful stuff. Well, what if your world is nothing but pain? Can the Epicurean approach give you any route to happiness? Like the whole mechanism of prudentially selecting your wants. Well, what if your only want is centered on I don't want to hurt anymore? And then you can't achieve that, no matter what prudential mechanism you use. That's where Epicureans, there may be a kind of blind spot in that notion. And the Stoics, by the way, think that there is. They think there's a very big one in there. So Stoics, how are they different? Well, let's start simple, like with Epicureans. The Epicureans is what is happiness? Getting what you want. Okay, so if we can get more of what we want, then we'll be more happy. Well, so how do we get what we want? Well, we need to analyze what we want before we truly commit to it so that it's within our realm of attaining it. And then it's like, okay, so now we can get it. Now we go for it. And so the idea is if we rein in our wants and expectations, desires, life goals to be more realistic to what our resources and our abilities are, then we will achieve those wants or fulfill them more frequently. We'll be more happy. So it's all about what you can obtain with Epicureanism. The Stoics are going to be like, well, what should you want? Well, the Epicureans will say you should want what you can get. The Stoics will say, no, you should always want exactly or precisely what you actually get. They're very different. So what does that look like? The Epicureans would say, okay, you want a car. You look at your means. I got $20,000. Okay, I get a car. Well, the Stoics would be like, okay, well, what if you don't get that car? What if it's sold? And then you're with this other car. And that's all you can get. Well, you should be totally pleased with that. And she said, even though you thought you really wanted this other car, it got sold ahead of you. Now you've ended up with this one that wasn't even your third choice. And you're kind of like, man, this isn't really what I wanted. The Stoics should say, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. You should think about it like, yep, that's the car you got. That's what you actually got. So now you convince yourself that's what you wanted all along. So always want exactly what you get. And that's interesting if you think about it. We get a lot of things in life, and we're supposed to want every one of them. How do we do that? And then there it is right here with Epictetus is seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish. Namely, you get what you originally wanted. But wish the things which happen to be as they are. And you'll have a more tranquil flow in life. And that's the key to Stoicism right there. That's one of the keys to it, is want exactly what you get, even if you don't initially think that it's what you wanted. So someone breaks into my house and I'm supposed to want it. Yes. According to the Stoics. My spouse dies. I'm supposed to figure out that's what I wanted. Yes. According to the Stoics. Initially, that may be like, you'd be like, whoa, that's kind of crazy. But it's still the Stoics. And it's maybe not as crazy as you think. Well, let's keep going. There's more to it than you initially think, maybe. That one of the things you want to do with the Stoics is you have to change your mentality entirely. Like I said, the Epicureans are thinking in terms of getting what you want, meaning that the world has things that you want. You have abilities to get some of those things and some of those pleasurable things. Well, the Stoics are like, you have no control over that stuff. You have no control over whether there'll be cars there when you want to buy them or that you'll get the one you actually can afford. That can be sold from under you. We have no control if somebody's going to like us or not. I mean, we can do things, yes, but that person has a mind of their own. They could choose us or not. But even more so is that we're like a leaf that's caught in a hurricane of existence. This is a Stoic's worldview. This is the way they conceptualize the human lot in life. It's more similar to the early Greek worldview, where we're at the mercy of all these forces that are in our lives and interpenetrating our lives and our choices and our abilities. And that we're like the leaf getting caught in the hurricane. The hurricane could blow that leaf through the mud, through brambles, and then throw it in a fire. Or the hurricane could blow that leaf in a nice little pleasant, cool place under a tree where it's never bothered again. And then it's just content under in the shade in the tree. Well, either way, we have no control over that. And so if you think about it, there is truth to this, that we can't stop tornadoes from tearing our houses down. We can try to build where we don't think tornadoes are going to be. We can build, very stout, weather-resistant structures. But if it gets big enough and bad enough, it can destroy that stuff. We can get our house or our new car that was within our wants, like the Epicureans tell us, but then here comes the tornado and destroys that car the next night. It's like we don't control these external things in the world. We're at the mercies of them. We're like that leaf in the hurricane. So if that's the way reality actually is, for the Epicureans, reality is populated with all these pleasurable and painful things, and we want to get the pleasurable ones and we want to avoid the painful ones, and we want to do that within our means, then we'll be happy. But with the Stoics, it's like the world is not populated with easily attainable things. It could be, but it certainly doesn't have to be. And it certainly seems more like, for them at least, Stoics, that reality's just has so much. It's a very ordered and structured existence. There's a rationality to reality that we should learn about, according to the Stoics. We need to understand that that reality is divinely governed and all these things. Like there's this divine will and providence that's working out for the Stoics. And there's fate and stuff and these notions in them. So their spiritual religious perspective is different than the Epicureans. But also in that is that we do not have very much, we have no control essentially over all the stuff that's happening around us outside of our minds. For the Stoics, the only thing that we have true control over, and we have massive control over it, is our own minds. We can control our minds inside our heads, but we cannot control what's happening in the external world. And so if that's the case, now reassess their notion of you should always want exactly what you get. Why? Well, because you're going to get what you get. That you can't control what you get. So the best thing you can do is resign yourself and accept whatever you got and then convince yourself that's what I wanted to begin with. That you may initially say, well, I don't want, somebody to break in and steal my stuff. But if it happens, there was nothing you could have done either way. You could have put all the security systems, whatever. You just get clever thieves, clever home invaders. And so you never really owned the security that you thought you had. What you had is you had a stability moment in life. You had security, but it failed when those smart, clever home or robbers or burglars came in. And so that shouldn't surprise us. That it's like, so instead of saying, oh, I'm robbed and woe be me, the Stoic would say, no, you can change your mind in the way you think about it to be like, well, I did my best. I got robbed. It's not the end of the world. I guess it's what I wanted. You may still not be convinced, but the Stoics will continue. But the key to it all, and there's plenty of examples of how we're more like a leaf in a hurricane than a human in a world populated with things to indulge our wants in. But it's also, the idea of we're all at the mercy of governments in contemporary society. There's missile technology today that can show up in any country in the world, be launched from another country, and not be detected within that. There's only like 6 to 30 seconds that the actual militaries in the countries would say, whoa, there's something coming in. By then, it's too late to do anything. I mean, how is that not like a leaf in a hurricane? It's an interesting example to think about, especially in contemporary times. But you can do less dramatic. Is that, say you ask somebody to a concert, the person agrees, then they don't show up. It's like you obviously don't control that person. Otherwise, you would have made them show up, but they didn't. So you see how there's this sort of, we're at the mercy of the chance of the world. If things will align, maybe they do, maybe they don't. That's the Stoics' perspective. Is that life is we are very much at the mercies of everything that's outside our own minds for the Stoics. And so if we want the best chance to secure happiness, we should never want or expect reality events or things to be any different than they actually are or happen to be. So how exactly are we supposed to do that? Was perception control. And this is still used to this day. It's in all substance abuse counseling of some version of it or another. And it does work, what the Stoics are describing. We have lots of data and lots of examples that will keep supporting these ideas that the Stoics are talking about. Maybe not exactly the same way they describe it. But the core idea is this, that how do we change? The world hands us a disaster. how is it that we can come to convince ourselves that that disaster is indeed not a disaster? It's actually what we wanted. Remember, the Stoics, they're still running on this idea that if you get what you want, you'll be happy. Well, the idea is the Stoics say, well, you should always want exactly what you get. Well, then you'll always be happy, right? That's how the reasoning works. But remember, if happiness and wants are disconnected, like some perspectives have, then the Stoics and Epicureans, their starting point can be questioned. But you can ask, like, well, how do we actually learn to accept? And whatever we get is what we actually wanted. Well, we have to resign oneself to the reality that there are a great many things that we tremendously want or care about that exist out in the external world. And unfortunately, nearly all of it's completely out of our control. That's the first belief that you get with the Stoics. Remember, the Epicureans, you believe that the gods are so different, they don't really care what we do, and you believe that death is nothing to be afraid of, and then you get your technique, your mechanism of prudentially navigating your wants. Well, with the Stoics, one of the biggest, a core belief, is that first of all, reality is so far beyond our control that we can't control what's happening outside of our external body, and we need to truly start to believe that, the Stoics would say, that everything changes mentally, emotionally, once one realizes things are out of their control. And you can think back to the early Greek spiritual worldview. It's similar. It's similar to that in a lot of religious and spiritual worldviews. That this is not our world. This is God's world. This is the gods and goddesses world. And we're just happen to be along for the ride. Whatever they come up with is whatever we have to go along with. But the world is not ours to manipulate and control. It's under the purview of various divine entities, beings. Well, the Stoics, and they say, yeah, that's true, but theirs is a sort of singular God that's very rational, very orderly, things like that. They have a different kind of deity perspective than, polytheism with multiple gods and goddesses. But some of them are fine with that too. But either way, that whether that or not, gods or goddesses, just the simple stuff is beyond our control. Like if you want to date somebody, but they don't want to date you, or you think they do, but then they don't show up, this kind of stuff. Or you have a lot of money, you've saved, you've done right, then it gets stolen. I mean, that seems more like a leaf in a hurricane, right? That's what the Stoics are going to emphasize, is this uncontrollable world that we happen to exist in. And so we have to resign ourselves to that. And one can read this and see if they persuade you. But okay, so now we know the world's uncontrollable. Well, what's the next step? What's the technique? Well, Epictetus and other Stoics identified. I just use Epictetus, Epicurus because their quotes are easy enough to understand. But there's plenty of other Stoics, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, others that talk along these same lines. And there's other Epicureans besides Epicurus. But they all basically say similar things. Well, the thing is with the Stoics, we should try to control, or what causes us distress is our opinions and judgments of things. Essentially, we're not thinking about things right, and then we get upset, but it's because we weren't thinking about it right. We're upset of our own making. Not the world is not making us upset. We made ourselves upset because we're thinking about what happened in a way that causes us to be upset. And I use an example here of a person walks in a room, you're in a room minding your own business, and then somebody comes in and they insult you. I mean, imagine a real bad insult, like, woo, you're hideous today. For no reason. I mean, you're sitting there minding your own business and then someone comes in and says, whoa, goodness, you're not pleasant to look at today. I mean, you can react to that various ways. You can immediately be, whoa, that person just insulted me. And then you get mad. And maybe you leap out at them, like, how dare you insult me? That's one way you can perceive it. The Stoics would say, yeah, now you're distressed. Now you're angry. You perceived it as an insult and you reacted accordingly, but it's that perception, that interpretation moment. And that's what happens right here. That this is the chain of events, and you can read through all this stuff, that you have the person's words that were not very nice. You receive those words in your mind, your ears, you hear them, your auditory system and your brain, they collect the words in the sounds. Then you interpret those words. You perceive them in a particular way. You form an opinion and judgment about what you have perceived, but that's based off of the interpretation you gave them. It was an insult. Those words insulted me. They offended me. But you get to this interpretation, then your judgment, opinion, belief forms. Then your emotions and all that follow from your belief. If you believe you're insulted, well, then you're going to feel a certain way. Anger, distress, hurt feelings, lower self-esteem, all those kind of things. But where are these flowing from? Well, they're flowing from your judgment, opinion, but where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from your original interpretation. So say that you have someone, you're in a room minding your own business, and somebody comes in and says something you're horrific looking today. Well, you could interpret that as, well, they insulted me. And it happens real quick. I mean, these are fractions of seconds in your mind. But the Stoics would say we can interrupt this train of events. And instead of leaping to this person insulted me, we could think in terms of and perceive those words in the context of, well, this is one of my old nearest and dearest friends. They just said something that's very out of character. And they must be having a bad day. What's going on in their world? I care about this person. I don't worry about what they said. I worry more about what's going on in their mind. Maybe I can help them. Well, that's going to generate an entirely different set of emotions than if you start out with, they said something I interpreted as an insult or an offense, and then I jump to belief formation, I jump to emotions coming right after it, then all of a sudden I'm acting out in the world, leaping at them. Whereas if instead you can interrupt that train of events and stop any of these others like D through G from happening, or make them happen very differently, if you intercept the moment of interpretation in our own minds. Which if you think about that, I just described how that would work. Instead of immediately you hear things that you think are offensive, stop and think and be like, well, what is the context? What are these these words? Yeah, if I just straight up interpret them as is, that in the cultural context we're in, or social or political, whatever, that they would be offensive, or some people would say they are. But am I supposed to just go along with those people, or what? Or maybe I have some other context. Maybe I can think about, well, what are the alternative possibilities? Don't just leap and go with the first interpretation of when we hear something, we see something, someone tells us something. You watch a thing on the news, not to just leap and immediately say, oh, yeah, it's happening again. Instead of that, think about what you've actually seen in terms of a lot of different perspectives. Once again, you're stopping to think, just like the Epicureans are stopping to think about your wants and realistic attainment of them before you really want it. The Stoics are saying injecting a stop and think. That's this bold stuff. And that's one way to simplify the two positions, is they're both encouraging us to stop and think and take time and consider alternative possibilities or consequences. Do a lot of thinking before we ever get to the emotions. Prevent the emotion train from being the first thing that grabs a hold of us and runs away with us. And that will prevent us from getting nearly as upset, distressed, and we'll be more happy. And so I'll leave it to everyone in the class to read through that and think about it. But it is very interesting. Whether the Stoics and the Epicureans convince you one way or another, you'll get a chance to think about that in this week's discussion. But definitely read this stuff and think about the examples. Because each is very powerful. And that is how, like I said, Stoicism is used to this day in like very substance abuse stuff, is what a large part of it is. You get a person that wants to quit a substance, and then what the counselor will do is help that person figure out to change their perceptions of the world and events and the substance itself. That will change their beliefs and their emotions about that substance, and then that changes their behavior. Namely, they don't go for the substance anymore. So instead of the drug or alcohol or whatever it is, being the thing that you associate with good and happy stuff. You every time you see it or taste it, you associate, oh, this is great stuff. What the substance abuse counselor will do is to get you to think about, are you interpreting that in a productive way? If you want to stop drinking or drugs, you want to stop the behavior, we'll try to intercept the interpretation earlier, right after the sensory experience, and start associating, well, this beer doesn't taste good. It tastes like the trouble I'm going to get into after I drink it and then go do other things and get into trouble. I'm not saying that's the way it's always going to work out when someone drinks, but an addict, that is how it tends to work out a lot of times, is people want to stop substance using because of all the bad behavioral and punishment consequences that comes from it a lot of times. And so if people want to do that, that you try to you try to train and teach and help people develop the mental skill to intercept and reinterpret the substance, and then that changes all the other things down the cause chain. So Stoicism is still used, more so than Epicureanism. So there's no doubt it does work. A person can reinterpret. And so think about it. And so there's a decent example to think about, is that you want actually what you get. Well, the idea would be, you can think in terms of, do I want bad consequences? No. Okay. So let me reinterpret the substance so that maybe bad consequences won't happen. I won't do the same feelings for it. I won't have the same beliefs. I won't have the same behaviors. Well, then the idea is, well, what are you doing in that process? You're wanting to not want the substance. So you should want exactly what you get. So you have withdrawals. Well, yeah, okay, I want these withdrawals because that means I'm stopping the bad behavior on the tail end. That I want, some of the social disconnection from friends that say you would used to have done the substance with. That's kind of suffering. It's not very pleasant, but I want that because that means I'm not using the substance. You see how that works? Think about that, and that may be a helpful example so a person can see that the Stoics are not, they're not saying something that's impossible to do. So also, well, we end the Stoics with this notion of Marcus Aurelius, which is a Roman emperor, and I include this so that you can see the Stoic that we were reading, Epictetus, by the way, he was a Roman slave. He was a slave to a wealthier, politically powerful Roman, but he was still a slave. And he had to navigate all these very dangerous Roman politicians and rich people, the emperors, those kind of things. So Epictetus, even though he's a slave in the Roman court, he's still, in some sense, he's better off if you're anonymous out there just somewhere in Rome. But you're under the eye of all these very powerful people that can be very fickle. And you see why the Stoics would say life is you're like a leaf in a hurricane, that the people that were coming up with Stoicism, some of these people were in very, very, very difficult decisions. But also, interestingly enough, it is very stressful to be the emperor of Rome. That in Rome, when it became an empire, that the emperor, if you became the emperor, you just instantly said, well, I don't want to live but a few more months or years. That even if you didn't say that, that was the normal lifespan of a Roman emperor near the end, especially as it was falling apart, the empire in the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern went a long time after that, but the Western Roman Empire, which is what a lot of people think of the Roman Empire as the Western one, but there was an Eastern one, very influential, became the Byzantine Empire. But the thing is that it was, if you signed up to be the emperor, you ran for that, you were ambitious and wanted to be the emperor, it was a very dangerous job. All the people around you want to be emperor too, so you're surrounded by people with knives. Remember Caesar? Julius Caesar is the thing that Shakespeare popularized in his play about Caesar is et tu, Brute. And you too, Brutus? That's Brutus, after him and the others have stabbed Caesar because they considered him to had become too ambitious. And they get rid of him. Then here comes another emperor. Then there's a big war in Rome. Very unstable, even at these elite levels. So Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic, and he wrote his meditations, and they're Stoic meditations. So it's interesting to see that Stoicism worked to help even the emperor intercept certain interpretations so that he wouldn't be emotionally distressed all the time and make bad decisions as the emperor. And there's some examples here. Don't waste the rest of your time here worrying about other people. Well, that makes sense. That he would have been incapacitated and paralyzed as a emperor of Rome if he sat there and was constantly worried about who's plotting and scheming behind him. And what are they talking about over there while they're whispering? That would run him just totally mad, I mean, where you couldn't function at all. And his job as emperor demanded that he be able to still function. And so he became a Stoic. So in summary, both the Epicureans and the Stoics, they worked really hard to come up with these contributions of how to intercept and work on either what our abilities are and tailor make our wants to more obtainable things we can actually achieve, or with the Stoics to intercept our initial interpretations to make it so whatever we get is what we convince ourselves we wanted. And so it's two different ways to try to get to the same end of securing happiness or contentment, tranquility, all that. And there's various other comments about Stoicism here. But one thing to think about is Epicureanism is crafted in stressful times, but perhaps not the worst of times. And so they're going to focus on how to be happy and not the absolute worst of times. Stoicism is tailor-made for how to still be happy in the absolute worst of times. So Epicureanism, sometimes it's said, is more of a peacetime self-help, whereas Stoicism is a wartime self-help. It's just another way to kind of make sense of what's going on with these. But they can both be used in either scenario, but is Epicureanism going to be as effective in times of war as Stoicism? Maybe not. But is Stoicism going to be as effective in times of peace and abundance? Maybe, maybe not. It just depends on how it's used. But you can think about those things while you're thinking about this for this week's discussion. Now, the last two, I'm not going to go into as much detail on these, and that's fine. There's a lot more detail that could be said about them, but you can get the core ideas of the Hellenistic skepticism and the Hellenistic cynicism easier than the Epicureans and the Stoics. So what is the skepticism? Essentially, their thing is, if you want to be happy in life, never believe anything that would make you unhappy, or don't commit to believing. They would say that what causes a tremendous amount of stress and strain in our lives is just committing to things, believing things. So if you don't do that, you'll be better chance of being happy. So what kind of beliefs could cause us distress? Well, say if you're you become a big fan of a particular sports team, and you say, oh yeah, player Z is the best player of all. But once you believe that, what happens when someone else comes along that supports maybe the same team or a different team, and you say, yeah, player Z's the best player. And then they say, no, it's not. Nah, not at all. There's this other player, Y, that's way better. Well, now you're in a conflict. Whereas if you never committed to any player being the best, then you don't have this conflict. And so think about that in terms of other claims. One group or an individual could claim the gods don't exist. Another could say the gods do exist. And say each of those people believe those things fully. Well, then they're set up to be in a clash with each other because those are incompatible. The gods can't exist and not exist at the same time. That'd be a contradiction. So if you believe one of the two, you've set yourself up to have to do battle with the other, or at least every time someone says it, it's going to irritate you. If someone says, well, the gods don't exist, or a person believes that, and then here's someone talking about the gods as if they do exist, that's going to irritate you, annoy you. Versus someone who does believe the gods exist, and now you got someone over here talking about, no, they don't. Well, that'll irritate and annoy that person. So the skeptic solution is to say, well, neither of you probably know the whole of it either way. So why just don't commit to either option? Just say, I don't assent to either one. I don't know, and I don't think any of us have the ability to know it. So I just don't believe one way or another. I don't believe that gods don't exist. I don't believe they do exist. I don't believe in either one. That's the skeptic solution. And they come up with these contrasting arguments, like to try to help people develop this skill is through various argumentation, which is kind of neat. I mean, it's got its own kind of interest here. Is that they come up with, like, and I use that claim that the gods exist versus the gods don't exist. And I give you an example here of how that worked. And they created lots of writing about all kinds of things, like a Roman policy, like this is the better law. And they'd be like, well, I don't believe it's the better law. I don't believe it's the worst law. I don't think we're able to know one way or another right now. So I withhold assent or belief from both options. And so if you can go through life and just essentially believe as little as possible, well, then you stand the best chance of being happy, because it's what we believe is what causes us distress, according to the skeptics. It's when we commit to things and we truly believe in things that we're willing to battle or fight or push back against when someone challenges those things. And then that's creating friction and stress for everybody. So if you want not only yourself, but others to be more happy, then everybody should just not believe much of anything. It's not that they deny things. They just don't believe it. They just don't commit to say, yeah, that's true. Or no, yeah, that's false. You don't go to those things. You intercept your judgment once again. You're intercepting where you would normally think, well, that seems plausible. Well, maybe that's true. Oh, I got some more evidence. Oh, that's true. So I believe that. They would say you should drop in at that moment where it's like, well, that seems plausible, and say it's plausible, but we don't really know. None of this evidence is definitive, so I'm just not going to go any further in the chain. I'm not going to commit or believe to it. Interesting. Will that make a person happy? Just avoiding to the maximum possible extent believing anything? Interesting. It's an option. Finally, the cynics is happiness against conventional grain. The cynics are interesting. The idea is we're most happy if we're not conforming. So happiness is achieved through nonconformity and getting other people through not conforming to the norm. The normal practices, normal beliefs, normal way of doing things. If people normally don't eat in a place, well, you'll be happier if you do eat in that place. Now you can think about it, is that plausible or not? But that's what the cynics did, is they would, Romans, like, if everybody's wearing shoes, I don't wear shoes. If everybody, lines up and walks on one side of the street, I walk on the other. It's like this rebellious quality, but there's a point to it. That it's not just rebelling for the sake of rebelling, it's purposive rebellion to try to get other people to maybe, see that the convention is not as well worked out as maybe they thought. And that it's to give them an opportunity to free their minds a little bit from what they've been assuming is the norm, and that's good. Then they see you doing something different, and it's like you're doing the different. You'll be more happy because not only is your mind and our possibilities more free, then you're encouraging others where their minds and possibilities will be more free. And then the more free, the more just, the more virtuous, we have more opportunities to be those things if we're kind of pushing against conforming and convention. Some would say that's quite stressful, but but it's supposed to create less stress. That's the cynic idea. And so that's the cynics. And you can read through it. There's other examples in it. Now, the key thing, how are we going to end this thing? Well, we end with some questions. And these are largely what this week's discussion is about. Do any of these four, after you read through the handout and carefully think about it, watch this video, is think about, do any of them seem better or worse able to secure more happiness? We've seen the Epicureans, we've seen the Stoics in detail, and we've seen just preview kind of the skeptics and the cynics. But do any of those suggestions, one of them in particular, seem like it's better able to secure happiness in a precarious and or stable world? Or maybe a group of them. Maybe some combo skeptic Epicurean mix would give a better chance at securing happiness. Or maybe it's a cynic stoic mix or whatever. You can, there's four you can mix and match. That's possible too. But either way, the sort of core idea is to think about is there value in each of these? Do each of them maybe have some truth and insight they're offering us? Or maybe are all of them mistaken in some fundamental ways? Either way you go, we get a chance to think about it and talk more about it in this week's discussion. Until then.